is such an honor for me to be part of, three intersecting communities of scholarship that I like to consider myself a part of, represented by the Center for Buddhist Studies. I feel like I'm a part of the Buddhist Studies community, the Asian Pacific American Studies new program. That's an area that I feel also connected to, in the East Asian Studies Department. That's obviously an area that I feel, my own scholarship is a part of, and grateful not only to the three organizations and these areas of study, but the fact that today is the Day of Remembrance and commemorating, as the Japanese American community does every year, what happened to the community back in World War II. And, it's a bit about, in part, it has to be about what that executive order, what the government intended with the forced removal and the indefinite incarceration that followed of the community that especially lived on the Pacific coast. But then to me, it's also a day of remembrance about what the community itself did in reaction to these government mandates. So I hope I can present to you something of a perspective today. I was told I have about up to 60 minutes, and then we'll take questions up until the end of our time together. But I want to try to accomplish three things today, and if I could do that by maybe I'll first share my screen, and then we'll start the formal lecture bit if I can get this to work. So what I want to do is do three things today. One is, as Brett mentioned, give a little bit of a sense of my book, American Sutra, the kind of Buddhist angle or take or perspective on the World War II Japanese American incarceration. But then move after that to how that history is connected to our more contemporary or current moment in American life, and talk about kind of racial justice today. And finally, kind of bring it together by talking about a project that I've been trying to pursue around the collation of the names of the roughly 125,000 persons of Japanese ancestry who experienced incarceration back in World War II, as a way to honor them. And this project that I'm working on to build a monument to those names. So that's a third kind of thing I want to do, especially today as the Day of Remembrance. But let me first start with a couple of maps and a couple of stories to just set things up about what I did with the book. I came to the United States when I was 17 years old, and my mom is Japanese, my dad being British. I didn't have any family connection to this history. And I would only come to learn about the existence of all of these different types of confinement sites when I was in graduate school. Professor John mentioned, we were both students at Harvard and in graduate school, and I had the privilege of working with Professor Masatoshi Nagatomi, Harvard's first professor of Buddhist studies. I was right at the tail end of his career, and he had some much better students before me kind of work with him. But I got pretty close to the Nagatomi family, and when he did suddenly pass away, right after I had finished my dissertation, the family asked me to organize the memorial service for him at the Harvard Yard Memorial Chapel, and also help clean up his offices at Yenching, his office on campus. And this was my kind of like mysterious karmic connection to this World War II history, was through a Buddhist priest diary that I found in Professor Nagatomi's office as I was helping the family settle his affairs and clean things up at the office. And you can see here one page of the many pages that had the name Nagatomi on it. And I used to have to take some of Professor Nagatomi's handwriting and kind of translate it into notes. And that was one of my things I did for him. And I could tell it was a different handwriting. And as it turned out, it was not his handwriting, but his father's, Reverend Shinjo Nagatomi's handwriting, a diary from World War II from a place called Manzanar, one of the War Relocation Authority camps during World War II. And as I started looking through those sheafs of paper, there were some sermon notes of Dharma talks he gave as a Buddhist priest in camp. And there was a diary with his observations about life in camp. And as a way to just honor my teacher, I translated this diary for the family and somehow began to become immersed in Japanese American history, because to do a good job of translation, there would be these, katakana words, these words that were like non-Japanese words, like mesuhoru, a mess hall, things that I guess people who know a lot about World War II Japanese, it's a very obvious word, but at the time I was so ignorant and I had to basically learn so much. And what I try to do is read everything that's ever been written, primary, secondary sources in English, in Japanese, written about the World War II Japanese American experience, as a way to not only translate this diary, but then somehow word got out that there were other people who had Buddhist fathers, or Buddhist priest fathers, or grandfathers, or uncles. And I started translating quite a number of these type of documents. And I said I wanted to start today with some maps. And so this is what I want to do to orient ourselves. Once I got into studying all of these, primary materials from the World War II camps written in Japanese language, one of the things I had to kind of learn very quickly was this much longer history of America. And when I first came to the US, I landed in Portland, Oregon. I went to a small liberal arts school there called Reed College. And I was 17 years old, my first time in the US, but quickly I became familiar with one kind of story of America. It was a story that said England became New England, the Pilgrims and the pioneers moved ever westward. And I would come to learn of our rival college across the way in Portland called Lewis and Clark. I would come to become a big fan of the local NBA basketball team called the Portland Trail Blazers, and essentially came to be immersed in one kind of vision of America, one that was a replication of European, especially Anglo Protestant world, moving from Europe across the Atlantic to New England and across ever westward to, in some sense, manifest the destiny of a nation. And so as these so-called trailblazers moved ever west, occupying lands that they believed were devoid of civilization, to be filled with European civilization, to be filled with the Christian faith, all ordained by God, there came to be a certain kind of notion of what America is. And where, Brett, when I was at the UC Berkeley as a professor there, I came to learn, for example, of the founding of the university in the town and why it was called Berkeley. And it's named after a man, George Berkeley, in the British pronunciation, an Anglican priest, a poet, and a philosopher. And apparently when the university was being founded, they were standing where it's known as the Founder's Rock, looking across the place that is the location for the Golden Gate Bridge today. Of course, there's no bridge at the time, but the Golden Gate towards the Pacific, looking ever westward. And they recalled this line from a poem called America by George Berkeley. Westward the course of empire takes its way. The first 4 acts are already past. The 5th shall close the drama with the day. Time's noblest offspring is the last. So a new world, a new offspring, a new territory of God that this Anglican priest talks about as one that's defined by this westward journey. But it always occurred to me when I thought of my own kind of journey to America coming from Japan, that this doesn't represent, the experiences of most Asian American people. This is not the story of America for them, nor for Central Americans whose journeys to America are northwards. And it struck me when I was doing research on the book, when I came across this poem by Nyogen Senzaki called Leaving Santa Anita, written in 1942, about a different concept of a vision of the nation, the division of a different direction of religion and civilization and peoples. Nyogen Senzaki writes this poem in contrast to George Berkeley. This morning, the winding train like a big black snake takes us as far as Wyoming. The current of Buddhist thought always runs eastward. This policy may support the tendency of the teaching. Who knows? So when he uses the word current of Buddhist thought always runs eastward, it's based on this Japanese rendition, Bukkyo Tozen. And you can find it in Nihon Shoki and other kind of early Japanese texts, this word Bukkyo Tozen. And what they referred to was the idea that although Buddhism began in India and has its roots there, the Buddha, right before he passes away, delivers a prophecy that after his death, of course, he would no longer be present, but the Dharma would continue, and that Dharma would move inexorably eastward. And so back when Buddhism was first introduced to Japan, they had this notion in the classical texts of Japanese history that Bukkyo, Buddhism, To, like eastward, Zen like advances or kind of pushes forward. And so they had this idea that the easternmost part, off the continent, these islands of Japan, has finally received the Buddha Dharma in its eastward movement. But if you look at Senzaki's poem, he's saying this policy may support the tendency of the teaching. And this policy, what he's referring to, is the US Army's policy of rounding up everyone of Japanese ancestry to go to places further east, like Wyoming. He ends up in a camp, a War Relocation Authority camp called Heart Mountain in Wyoming. And he's writing this poem from a place called Santa Anita. It still exists. It's the Santa Anita horse racing track, where he's living in a so-called temporary assembly center in a place where he's writing this poem to his Buddhist community in Los Angeles, a multi-ethnic one. He had Japanese nationals, Japanese Americans, some Latinx members, Caucasian members, different groups of people. And of course, everyone with Japanese ancestry are having to follow this policy of needing to move to these camps. But he's writing this poem about this idea that as he's moving from California to Wyoming, maybe he may be fulfilling the prophecy of the Buddha that Buddhism is going to move eastward. So those were some maps I wanted to use to kind of orient ourselves to what is at stake in the study of this history. In other words, I think it's not just about one community's history. It's really about, at its heart, what is America? And is America a white Christian nation in its essential characteristic, or is it a multi-ethnic and religiously plural and free nation? This is to me the kind of bigger, enduring question that extends backwards and forwards from what happened in World War II. That there is a longer history, prehistory to what happened to the Japanese American community during World War II, and that there's an after effect that it continues and endures to this very day. Now, I'm not going to talk, at great length about all the things in the book, but I do want to note a few things that in the course of the research struck me. I mentioned I read many things as much as I could on the World War II Japanese American experience, and some of the things that I found out that were a little bit surprising included, for example, things like what happened on December 7th, 1941. Even before the smoke had cleared at Pearl Harbor, the FBI had begun to round up people, community leaders. But what's less well known is that 3 p.m., the first person's picked up. This is 30 minutes before the 3:30 issuance of the directive for martial law. So even before that had been done, the very first person picked up was Reverend Gikyo Kuchiba, the head Buddhist priest of the Hoppa Honganji Buddhist Temple in Honolulu, the largest Buddhist temple on the islands. And the second person picked up was somebody associated, I'm also a Soto Zen Buddhist priest. And so the second person picked up was a Buddhist priest from Taiheiji, Soto Zen Temple. And then they, of course, began picking up consulate affiliated persons, the key business leaders, other members of the Japanese American community who were not only on the Hawaiian Islands, but in the continental United States. And this group of people had Buddhist priests and Shinto priests in disproportionate numbers. 100% of Shinto priests were picked up. 72% of Buddhist priests were picked up in that very early period on the days and weeks right after Pearl Harbor. And a very small percentage, maybe like 10% of Christian ministers were picked up. So clearly religion mattered. And so this is one of the kind of areas I wanted to highlight today, was that it's not just that this was about racial prejudice, but it's where race and religion intersect that I think was at the heart of what motivated the incarceration. People like Reverend Miyamoto Buntetsu from the islands. He was a Jodoshu priest. This is one of his, the documents about warrant of arrest and so forth. And you can see that he was listed in Group A, individuals believed to be the most dangerous and who in all probability should be interned in event of war. Buddhist priests as a category, I would come to find out, along with Shinto priests, but not Christian ministers, were seen in general based on information gathered, compiled, analyzed by the Office of Naval Intelligence and the Army G2, and then shared with the FBI that came up with these kind of registries, I would say, like a list of people who were in Group A, Group B, Group C, that they had even prior to the war, years prior to the war, began making these lists. And even before making those lists, had Buddhist temples and Buddhist priests under surveillance. And so even though sometimes we talk about Pearl Harbor as a surprise attack, it was, I think, a surprise to intelligence agencies only in the sense that they expected the attack to come to Manila instead of Hawaii. But for years prior to the war, the fear and animus towards the Japanese as a racial group, but also a a religious group. We may recall at this time in American history, Japanese Americans represented the largest Buddhist group in the United States. And so this is an important thing I discovered after declassifying several thousand pages of intelligence agency notes and reports before the war. And what I realized as I was getting further and further into this research is that this history of animus based on both race and religion go much further back. I think we're probably somewhat all familiar with the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, the first federal immigration law that targeted one group of people. But in the lead up to the passage of that law, there was many years of anti-Chinese sentiment and animus that you can see it in these, popular publication images talk about building a Chinese wall around the United States of America, talk about a Chinese invasion coming to establish a heathen Chinese despotism, and so forth. And the slur word used at the time was the heathen Chinee, a group deemed racially unassimilable, perpetually foreign, and religiously unable to fit in as heathens or non-Christians in a vision of America as essentially a white and Christian nation. And so this type of thing happened back then. It happens in more recent times, for example, with the Muslim travel ban, where race and religion often get conflated as an issue of exclusion, or within inclusion as an issue of a second-class citizen. This, in the case of the Asian American experience, often gets linked to this idea of the yellow peril. And you can see this other Harper's Weekly thing. This is after the Exclusion Act is already passed, and further exclusion of Asians towards the Japanese are going to be coming in the decades that follow. But you can see here this idea of a land that is kind of filled with light emanating from the Christian cross, that is being threatened by these ominous dark clouds coming across with a Buddha in the middle of the clouds, as if that's the kind of invasion of something that is about to threaten the very basis and foundations of a notion of, if not the United States of America, many nations in Europe also engaged in this idea of the yellow peril. And in fact, it's actually German, Kaiser Wilhelm, the notion of yellow peril is transported across the Atlantic. And this very same imagery is used during World War II. You can see it here with, this man on the samurai behind the facade of the Buddha with this military, tank, an illustration from 1943. So this kind of linking of race and religion is one element I wanted to note. At the end of the day, with Executive Order 9066, if you read it, it actually doesn't talk about Japanese or Japanese Americans. It's neutral in language in that sense. But we know from then Attorney General Biddle's notes that it was meant, he called it, it's definitely meant for the Japs. That's the wording from that period. But so it's like the travel bans. They're legally neutral language, but the intended target of the animus is clear. And in the case of 9066, now we're no longer talking about community leaders and Buddhist priests and having some kind of like individualized selective internment, but a mass incarceration. It's an executive order that gave so much discretion to the US Army to define who would be a threat to the national security of America, that they just included everybody who had Japanese heritage. In my own experience of kind of studying, especially mixed race Japanese people during that time, just I was like curious, like what about people like me? I've been affected by executive, and this incident, one of the key architects of that executive order and its implementation, Colonel Carl Bendiston, in an orphanage in Los Angeles, where there are quite a few babies, 5-year-olds, 12-year-olds, like children of mixed race Japanese heritage at that time, because of anti-miscegenation laws, it wasn't so acceptable. And so sometimes these kids had to be given to orphanages. And the orphanage director asked Bendiston directly when he came to visit, are these babies and little children also of mixed race, also subject to Executive Order 9066? And he was told by Bendiston, if they have even a drop of Japanese blood, I want them in camp. And so that's how thorough it was. The official rule at one point was 1/16 Japanese, you need to be in camp. So it's either the 1-drop rule or the 1/16. There's some notion that basically everyone who had any of this heritage was subject to forced removal and indefinite incarceration. People ended up, initially, I talked about Santa Anita with Reverend Nyogen Senzaki, but people ended up places like, it's Puyallup, 30 miles south of Seattle. If you lived in the Seattle area, this is where you would have ended up as you awaited the building of the more permanent War Relocation Authority camps further inland. And so people would, be given sometimes a week, sometimes 10 days after those exclusion orders went up in your neighborhood to take care of your life. If you had a business, to sell it. If you're a farmer, try to handle the crop. Like, how do you deal with that? How do you deal with if you're enrolled in school? How do you deal with, and then people, obviously lost so much property. Their lives were completely disrupted. The stress and anxiety of going to a place unknown for a time indefinite, being told you have, you can take what you can carry. For most people, that meant a single suitcase, needing to worry about looking in your apartment or house to figure out what are you going to put in that suitcase, because you don't know where you're going, how cold it's going to be, where, how long. And so it's just a very disruptive moment. And as people entered these so-called, euphemistically called assembly centers for their initial period of incarceration in the spring into the summer and early fall of 42, they were, one of the things, first things that they learned was there's something called contraband. It's like going, when you go to prison, you can't bring in knives and guns and whatever. So they would confiscate those things, which that's a pretty, it was not so surprising. Cameras, they also confiscated. They didn't want the people to have cameras to document. But they also had one other thing that struck me, a ban on books, even if it's like a book of haiku poetry or, a Buddhist sutra. If it's written in the Japanese language, they had the generalized rule that was contraband to be handed into the authorities upon entry into this new life of confinement. And the only exceptions to that was if you had a Japanese language Bible or a English-Japanese dictionary. And to me, this indicated what I've been trying to refer to about this white Christian nation, this idea of Anglo-Protestant normativity. Anglo, both in the sense of English only, but also in the sense of whiteness and Christianity as this kind of norm to which everyone should should conform. And so if you needed the Japanese language to help you become more Anglo and Protestant, that was okay. So some families, Buddhist families, obviously didn't listen to that rhetoric. This family, for instance, this is Reverend Tansai Tarakawa. He was the head Buddhist priest at the Oregon Buddhist Church in Portland, and he unfortunately died in camp. But this is a picture of his daughter, Lillian, and she's playing, I'm sorry, his daughter Hiroko, who's playing checkers with her friend, Lillian Hayashi, at the Portland Assembly Center. And you can see here, they put up, they made their temporary housing just as decent and livable as possible, masking the smell of urine and manure that these often horse stables, livestock pens reeked of. And they try to make it, livable, but just have some human dignity in living in these spaces. But in addition to that, you can see they have a picture of the Buddha and a large American flag, making a case to themselves, if no one else, that you can be both Buddhist and American at the same time. And so people used, they adapted skillfully to their situation. To me, that's a very Buddhist approach of how the Buddha presented the Dharma, according to person, time and situation, etc., and how, in general, Buddhism adapts itself to the conditions. And in the case of, I'm going to move past that. In the case of Japanese American Buddhists in these camps, to be able to, in that moment of loss, in that moment of dislocation, have some way to gather again as a Sangha, the idea of being able to assemble and gather at a barrack facility, some kind of temple, a so-called barrack church, some initially in rec halls and mess halls, and then eventually its own buildings. People like the Nishura brothers, they were master carpenters who had built the San Jose Buddhist Temple and the Japanese Pavilion before the war in the Expo, and they're great carpenters. They found wood, desert wood, wood from the mess hall, vegetable crates, whatever wood they could get their hands on to make these beautiful altars. This is in that same camp that Reverend Senzaki was in at Heart Mountain, Wyoming. Other Soto Zen Buddhist priests, like in my tradition, who was in a Department of Justice camp, they had in that particular camp a rule or a ration of one piece of fruit per week. And he collected enough peach pits over a number of weeks to make an ojuzu or prayer beads. These were the kind of adaptations, skillful ones, that people made to maintain and craft again their faith in this moment of dislocation and loss. Others, like Reverend Takashi Setsu, he served as the abbot of Koyasan Buddhist Temple, Shingon Buddhist Temple in Little Tokyo in Los Angeles. He writes in his memoirs about his experience in different Department of Justice camps. He writes about how annoying it was that he had to be stopped by guards every time he wanted to go to the toilet at night and kind of answer certain questions before they'd let him go to the bathroom. He was talking about how those guards' lights, searchlights came into the barracks and how it prevented him from sleeping well. But one day he makes this entry: I return to the quiet and supreme life of walking alongside Kobo Daishi, the founder of Shingon Buddhism in Japan. As if trying to practice meditation under the moonlit pine, I've been viewing the guards' searchlights as the Buddha's sacred light and been practicing Komyo meditation together with Kobo Daishi. Instead of seeing the searchlights as a hindrance to his practice, he begins to use them as if they were like the moon, suffusing his consciousness and helping him and aiding him in his meditation. I'm going to skip that one. So now I want to, just because of time, I want to move to the second area of what I wanted to talk about today. And it's based on, because today's Day of Remembrance, I wanted to kind of think about what is remembrance and what does it mean to remember as a form of repairing difficult things, the difficult karmic things of not only one's personal past, but of a nation. And, you know, for those of us, like we know, like Anusmriti, you know, like the idea of visualizing the Buddha to make the Buddha, the absent Buddha, present again. Usually Nembutsu, you know, in Japanese, people think it means the recitation or the kind of the chanting of the Buddha's name, but it's really a little bit deeper than that. It's a kind of recalling of the absent to make present, and of course the practice of naming and vocalizing, almost like a mantra, is a powerful way of doing that. And I wanted to talk a little bit about how remembrance has been working for some Japanese American people that I've had the privilege of coming to know in more recent times. And I just wanted to show a few images here of these acts of remembrance are happening from the camp period. You know, little babies died that first winter. The tar paper barracks are not hastily built, not very well built. People, the most vulnerable, babies and elderly people, died that first winter into spring. And so Reverend Nagatomi, whose diary I mentioned at the very beginning, talks a lot about the number of funerals and memorial services he had to conduct. Here he is in 1943 in front of a monument that he helped to envision together with the architect, the Catholic architect Ryozo Kado, who had built some pre-war Catholic Japanese American facilities, and a group of people who, one of the blocks in Manzanar, together with the YBA, or the Young Buddhist Association, actually constructed this monument out of concrete. Reverend Nagatomi would go around barrack to barrack asking people for 5 cents or 10 cents per family to buy the concrete necessary, and he practiced those characters on there. I, de, to. To is, you know, tower. I, to, you know, to honor and recall, and de is the spirits, to remember these spirits, because he was very keen on making sure that all these people who were dying in camp would not be forgotten, and that he wanted to do it before the Obon ceremony of 1943. You know, in Japanese we call it Nibon, the first Obon after somebody passed away, is an important one to recognize these people who've passed away. And so this type of remembrance has been happening from even within the camps. And I wanted to talk about how this is connected to what I'm trying to do with this names monument. I think, as many of you know, there are places obviously like the Vietnam War Memorial, the 9/11 Memorial, the colloquially known, you know, lynching memorial in Alabama, where names are honored as a way of remembrance and repair of past injustice and trauma. And so what I wanted to do was to, in many ways, to engage a project of remembrance of all of the names. And I had an opportunity to join a wonderful group of Japanese American camp survivors and descendants who have been folding cranes. They call themselves Tsuru for Solidarity. And I'm lucky enough to be involved with this group. But it was founded by people who experienced these kind of like family separations and unjust deportation and indefinite incarceration, all the things that we hear about in our day. And as part of that, there was going to be a big gathering in Washington, D.C., where 125,000 cranes were going to be assembled and placed on the fence of the White House and so on. That event never was able to materialize in DC because of the pandemic. But one of the things I promised the group was that for each of the cranes, for each of the individual persons, I would like to, together with many other Buddhist priests and other people who would be willing to recite their names as a kind of act of making their lives present again. And in that process, I found out that I thought there was somebody would have a kind of master list that was accurate, comprehensive, and everything. And what I realized was there were partial lists and inaccurate lists and different kinds. And so I've been spending the last, since last, I guess, March, April, collating, collecting camp directories. This is an example of one from one of the Department of Justice camps. Camp rosters kept by the government, and so on and so forth. And I wanted to, I'm sorry, this is seems a little out of order. I wanted to show you some of these cranes that this wonderful group that, wanted to connect the past with the what's happening today, who saw standing up for other people today is actually an act of repair and healing, to stand in solidarity with other communities that are facing similar kinds of animus that the Japanese Americans faced back in World War II. And one of the co-founders of that group, at their very first gathering, made and put up some, I guess, cranes made of the, I guess, color photocopy of the cover of my book. And when I learned about that, I felt like I have no option but to try to do something of remembrance for each of these cranes and what they represent. And so I've been very invested in this project to collate all the names and to find different ways of displaying and remembering and honoring each individual who was incarcerated back in World War II. I'm going to skip it. So I mentioned certain kind of camp directories. There's some in Japanese, some in English, and it's just a big project to try to make sure we are rendering the names correctly, having a nomenclature convention about if people are listed in two camp rosters in two different ways, their names are spelled differently or wrong, or et cetera. How do you adjudicate that, and et cetera. And I really I'm inspired to do this. I've been spending sometimes 6 to 8 hours a day. Just my eyes have become so bad, like looking through these lists to make it. But every time I get tired, I think of what Reverend Nagatomi did back in World War II when he was trying to build this concrete monument. And he really wanted to recall these, the spirits of the ancestors to make sure that no one's forgotten. And so I've been thinking about what it would mean to build a similar monument today. And I've been trying to think about, the Ireto, it's a little bit hard to see that it's actually a gorinto, but it's a 5-tiered stupa or pagoda. and there's another one in a camp called Rower in Arkansas that Reverend Daitetsu Hayashima created and put up there. It has a big lotus flower petals on the bottom and this 5-tiered structure to it. So 2 World War II monuments have this kind of 5-tiered structure. And so I've been thinking about what would it mean to do a Gorinto kind of monument, and how would we display the names? And if you think about the Vietnam War Memorial, the number of people who died there are far fewer than the number of people who were incarcerated during World War II. And if you can imagine how much space that takes, one of the big challenges was like, how do you honor all these names when the numbers are so many? I decided to slightly copy Maya Lin's approach. She had a sequencing approach that had to do with date of combat death for the Vietnam War Memorial. And obviously we have camp survivors in the Japanese American community, so you can't do it by date of death. But I decided to sequence it by date of birth and to honor the elders first and those born when the camps were closing in 45, 46, coming last in the sequence. But then to have an algorithm to be able to, through light projection, display on that bottom cube section of the Gorinto over the course of 60 minutes, 125,000 names. And so that's a project that I've been working on to figure out the technology, figure out the way to honor and display these names, not only accurate and comprehensively, but in a beautiful way. And I've been thinking about also, and this is the last slide, also about the kind of the purpose of a names monument. And I've been drawing on some of my friends who are in the ceramics world and in tea ceremony and who I think many of you already would know that there is a Japanese tradition called kintsugi, kin meaning gold and tsugi coming from the verb tsugu, to join. And this idea that when you have a ceramic plate or a teacup, and if it breaks, instead of discarding it, you take up the shards, you rejoin them using lacquer resin. And additionally, you add gold adornment on top. And to me, I've been thinking about like reparations, the notion of repair. How do you repair these kind of racial injustices in America's past, whether it's slavery, Chinese exclusion, Japanese American incarceration, Native American, I mean, it's layered and affects many, many communities. And so how is it that we can have, maybe inspired by people like Reverend Hayashima and Reverend Nagatomi, these Buddhist priests during World War II who built these 5-tier Gorinto monuments in these camps, how can we build it? And so I've been thinking about this ceramic structure where we actually build it with a way for people to visit the monument and add a piece of gold to the monument and heal the monument thereby. It's based on the philosophy that, instead of throwing something out, you need to remember history. Instead of trying to hide the breaks, the fissures, the hurts, you record that history through the gold adornment. And gold is obviously, it's not just about the financial recompense and that kind of aspect of reparations, but it's a technique to note something of value. And so that's where I want to end today, that on a day of remembrance, that we remember names, we remember people, we remember in the way that the government didn't do. They just lumped all these Japanese Americans together, little children, infirmed grandmothers. They're not a threat to national security, but they were seen as a group. The Buddhists were seen as a group, not given and afforded their individuality, just treated as a number, treated as a group, and that thereby dehumanized, thereby kind of lowered in terms of the caste structure of the United States. And so I think that the value the goal, the worth of holding these days of remembrance is to remember some of these stories. The Reverend Nagatomis, the Nyogen Senzakis, those people that it isn't just about what the government did, but it's about what these people did, how they survived, how they persisted, how they were resilient, and how they repaired themselves, and how subsequent generations continue that need to repair ourselves as well, our nation and our communities. So with that, let me end, and I'm very happy to take any questions or comments from all of you. Thank you.